Thank you all for coming to tonight's reading with professor and author Maya Sonenberg. This evening lets us celebrate two newly published works of fiction. For Maya Sonenberg, it's the excellent 2022 Richard Sullivan Prize-winning book of stories, Bad Mothers, Bad Daughters. And for Anca Szilágyi, who was unfortunately able to attend tonight, it's her second novel, Dreams Under Glass. Maya will be reading from both books this evening. Maya Sonenberg is a professor of English and creative writing at the University of Washington. Her previous books and chapbooks include Cartographies, which was a winner of the Drew Hines Prize, Voices from the Blue Hotel, 26 Abductions, and After the Death of Shostakovich Père. Anca Szilágyi is originally from Brooklyn. She lived in Montreal, Seattle, and now Chicago, where she teaches creative writing. She has also authored Daughters of the Air, which Shelf Awareness called A Striking Debut from a Writer to Watch, and the Seattle Review of Books called A Creation of Unearthly Talents. After the reading, Maya will be taking any questions you might have. As a reminder, the store closes at 9, so we will be trying to take the last question by 8 and start heading up out of the reading space at 8:30 to make sure that our booksellers get home safe and on time. Maya will also be signing her books at the back table where you'll be able to purchase them from me. So thank you again for coming to tonight's reading, and please help me welcome Maya Sonenberg to the stage.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you all for coming on this rainy night. I really appreciate it. I'm so disappointed that Anca can't be here because I was really looking forward to chatting with her about our books. But I am going to read I know which part she was planning to read, so I'm going to read them for her. And before we get started, two brief things. First, a PSA. If you haven't already voted, please go vote. You know what to do. Second, a quote from Ursula Le Guin. The exercise of the imagination is dangerous to those who profit from the way things are, because it has the power to show that the way things are is not permanent, not universal, not necessary. But sometimes the imagination isn't enough, so back to number one. If you can and haven't done so yet, please go vote. Okay. So I'm going to read the opening of Anca's novel, Dreams Under Glass, and I urge you to pick up a copy. It is really, really wonderful. Then I'm going to read a couple of things of mine, go back to her, back to me. That's how it's going to go. And at the end, I'm happy to answer any questions. I don't think I can answer for Anca's. Okay, so here's the opening of Dreams Under Glass, and I think you will quickly find yourself situated in this world. The black car spat Binny out at 53rd and 3rd. The lawyer she was riding with had lost his casino bankruptcy trial, big time, and wore a pitiful countenance. She'd almost tried to put him out of his misery with a kiss. Had he noticed it was happening? She replayed in her mind the way she'd leaned slightly forward toward his sorry face and loosened tie. He could probably tell. Well, that was embarrassing. Mistakes, the price of knowledge. She'd pick up her paycheck and move on with her Friday night. The sun had already set, and she'd made plans while at the Newark stop on the Acela to meet her friend Gary for dinner. Romance had not been part of their history, although lately the relationship hummed with a subtle electric charge. They'd weathered several stupid relationships together, like hers with a boy who now squatted to be a diplomat and found Gary's Iraqi Jewish lineage titillating. Now they were, for the first time in their 5-year friendship, both single. The driver deposited her rolly bag on the sidewalk. The lawyer muttered from inside the car, "See you Monday." Her bag went thunk as her clearance rack heels clacked down the sidewalk. Gary waited for her beneath the pink granite pillars of the Lipstick Building, cheeks rosy from the first chill of fall, fists thrust into charcoal jacket pockets, a black knit cap hiding his brown curls. When he saw Binny, he lifted his head from its natural melancholic tilt and smiled. Still wound up from the trial, the loss, the pitiful lawyer, a harshness balled up in her chest. She said, "You could have waited in the lobby." His dark eyelashes brushed up against his wire-rimmed glasses. He said, "I've had my daily allotment of recycled air." She softened and they hugged, their usual platonic hips angled away from each other hug. "Want to come up?" The security guard took Gary's ID. The security arm at the gate buzzed open. Binny imagined an art project using robotic arms. Gatekeepers, access, automation, articulated arms moving like octopuses. But what did she know about robots? Stick to the basics, honey. On a huge sign by the elevator bank, the law firm Latham & Watkins advertised its presence in the building. But there were countless other mysterious tenants, investment firms and hedge funds and whatnot, celebrity divorce lawyers. Binny had shared the elevator with Uma Thurman once, a story which her father found thrilling. He claimed she looked like her. "Hardly," she'd said. "Let's start with how short I am, how frizzy my brittle hair, frail my bird bones." The firm she worked for, Capra Zaman Baxter, or CZB, was nothing fancy compared to Latham & Watkins or Uma Thurman's divorce attorney. A boutique, read Scrappy, firm with 3 partners, 1 full-time associate Binny privately dubbed the Zombie, a rotating cast of part-time contract attorneys and underlings like Binny. The elevator rocketed upward. Gary and Binny rode in silence, eyes glued to the TV screen. On the news ticker, Lehman Brothers was kaput, its bankruptcy announced that Monday. Sarah Palin, the folksy, self-proclaimed maverick governor of Alaska, performed her hockey mom pitbull with lipstick shtick, and Stephen Hawking unveiled something called a corpus clock, a time eater. Before Binny could ask Gary if he remembered that old Robin Williams movie about Yuppicide, the doors slid open with a ding and her phone buzzed. Okay, so that's the opening of Anca's wonderful novel. I'm going to read a couple of things from the new collection, Bad Mothers, Bad Daughters. In my way of thinking, there are sort of 2 sorts of stories in here. One sort is more fantastical, fairy tale influenced, and the other sort is more grounded in our contemporary lives. So I'm going to read some of each. I'm going to read first the beginning of, oh man, I changed my mind what I was going to read, and my little markers are now in the wrong place. I'm going to read the beginning of a story called Return of the Media Five, which you might pick up on, but it might help if I tell you that it's set in 1992. I am this heart, this brain, only these right now, no other. This is what Susan, that's her name now, tells herself every morning upon waking. She opens her eyes and sees the flaking ceiling above her, sees the wash of sunlight coming through leaves. She touches her chest, feels her heart beating steadily, no rush of fear, and exhales. She's alone. She touches her head, hair just starting to gray, and she's not bothering to color it. This can be my new disguise, she thinks, my new self, one of the million selves she's been in the last 20-odd years. She rubs her eyes, and before she can silence herself again, she remembers days when she thought more, remembered more, a million legs all running toward the Pentagon or Induction Center or Federal Courthouse. A Vietcong flag, giant puppets of Kissinger, Nixon, McNamara, or their heads atop the bodies of gigantic hawks, perched among the blackened trees of a burned landscape. Bring the war home. A placard of a napalm child. If people see, they will join us, and this atrocity will have to stop. A million hands waving, a million arms, fists raised in salute. They were the million legs and hands of her legs and hands, the million-limbed body of resistance, then revolution. Why does she allow these things to come back to her today? Because it's spring and her curtains are the color of a daffodil she handed to a child once at a demonstration. She remembers when the remembered voices were always with her, singing off-key but loudly together. She never felt alone. But then suddenly she was alone, amputated from everyone and everything she knew. Most mornings she silences these memories of memories if she manages to. It's a matter of self-preservation. If she does not remember her past, she'll make no slips, allow no one to find her, avoid the harsh slap of the law in the person of a policeman's hand. For they still behave that way, they do. When she sees it on TV, she must remind herself she looks like, no, is, a harmless, middle-aged white lady, no Rodney King. Her arresting officer would be younger than she is, wouldn't remember the 1960s, wouldn't even have been born then. She rises, washes her face most mornings, and with the night's sleep puts aside again the actions and the years on the run and all the melodrama. Oh, not a million. Don't be ridiculous, she says aloud. She's taken on only a dozen or so personas in all these years. Despite the plethora of glossy boxes, hair dye actually comes in only so many colors. Days she goes on with baking or laundry or typing or childcare or waitressing or whatever other ho-hum job she's doing. Goes on with taking the bus to work and stopping in the grocery store on the way home. Goes on with a movie on the weekends. Goes on with volunteering at the homeless shelter. Goes on with answering when her newest friend uses her newest name. She goes on with showing her fake ID and paying in cash. She used checks for a while, but was always scared she'd sign her real name. Goes on with moving or staying put as long as she can keep her stories from contradicting each other, as long as no one comes up to her in a bar and says, "Don't I know you from somewhere?" even when that's probably just a pickup line. Moves on to the next in a string of casual affairs or one-night stands. Sometimes she reminds herself that she could end this, contact a lawyer, retake her real name and her past. The charges, if any, have surely been dropped. Someone could find out for her. Even Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers resurfaced long ago. Look at the lives they've made for themselves. But then she thinks, what for? She's even been able to testify in front of the legislature and advocate for the homeless gals in the shelter with her fake name. Her past is so surely and totally past. The people from her past, like puppets with no hands to guide them, the places of her past inhabited by new occupants. She's landed here, 2 towns over from the Connecticut town she grew up in, but the landscape has been so utterly changed by bulldozers, subdivisions, Pierre de fabrics, strip malls, insurance brokers, real estate agents, and private beaches that she barely recognizes it. Well, so it goes. And the self of that past, despite this morning's rememberings, would she recognize her? I think I'll stop with that one there. So if you're wondering how this character belongs in a story about mothers and daughters, it turns out that she suspects she may be pregnant. And in thinking about that and thinking about whether she's going to have this child, she revisits a lot of her past. Anyway, and then, so the other mode in this book, as I said, is something that draws on fairy tales. And I'm going to start with reading one, and we'll see how much time there is. Maybe I'll read another short thing. This is my take on Little Red Riding Hood, called The Other Road. The spring rain was delicious, although he wondered how that term might apply to something he couldn't taste. It washed lilac through the open bedroom window, the bush outside thick with flowers, and this must be what woke him from a dream of lying beside his wife, a dream he had while lying beside his wife. She had walked through the open window carrying the baby and a basket of lilacs just as he set the chime on a new clock. In a different part of the country, his grandmother had raised him single-handedly in a cottage smelling of damp tweed and licorice. He'd been put on the train with just a basket of provisions, and he had one vague memory of the time before coming to live with her, a memory so inconsequential that I shall not relate it here. Outside his grandmother's gate, the road had turned right to the village and left to the forest. He was allowed to walk to school in the village, and he was allowed to venture in the other direction, but not as far as the forest or lake. One day, as he walked along, he glanced across the fields and for the first time saw another road running parallel to his own. Where had it been until that day? On the other road walked another boy, also wearing a red flannel shirt, also carrying a basket from which, even at this great distance, the smell of cookies seemed to drift. When the boys saw each other, they waved in exactly the same way. When one stopped waving, the other did too. When the boy turned his head, he saw that the roads converged in the distance, and he started to run toward that convergence. Behind the other boy had been the shadows of a man and a woman. He ran faster and harder than ever, and when he finally stopped, he found himself at the very edge of the forest, where he sat down on a log and allowed the trees to shade him. The lake glittered below. Something about a drowning bothered him. The other boy, where had he gone? And the other road? Soon, an old woman, not his grandmother, emerged from the forest carrying a basket and asked, "Are you lost?" At first, the boy was relieved, but then she walked on without waiting for an answer. As he tried not to cry, a hunter emerged from the forest, his rifle over one shoulder and a sack over the other. Whistling, he passed the boy by. The boy thought of a story his grandmother had told him about a hunter returning home after a long trip, entering his house through the great front window and joining his family. Then the boy dried his eyes on his shirt, and a woodsman emerged from the forest, his axe over one shoulder and a sack over the other. He sat down next to the boy and wiped his forehead. Something red bulged from the sack, and a familiar odor emerged, something like wolf, blood, or cookie. After a while, the woodsman told him a story about returning home after a journey, such a long journey that his mother and father had given him up for dead. He approached his home at night, watched his parents a long time through the great front window, their faces happy in the candlelight, and turned away. So, not all the fairy tale-ish stories in this book draw on specific tales. Some of them do, and some of them just have what the wonderful writer and editor Kate Bernheimer calls a fairy tale feel. So there's that. I think I'm going to jump back into Anca's book. As you may have picked up from those opening pages, Vinny, in addition to working at a law firm as a paralegal, it turns out, is also an aspiring artist. And so Anca was planning to read this section to you. It includes Vinny's imaginings of a work of art she might possibly make. And I have to tell you right up front, I really, really want this to happen in the real world. Eyes unfocused, Vinny imagined the whole building empty, the building where she works. Like the empty buildings of downtown Wilmington, only 100 times bigger and more catastrophic. What if the whole building, echoing, abandoned, became an art squat? The light would be different, of course. Not the harsh, white flickering she'd become accustomed to, but the sun, fractured by the surrounding skyscrapers, the relentless curve of the lipstick building's stacked ovals. What would the thing be, abandoned and given over to art? How many walls could be knocked down without the structure collapsing? And how many panthers could she set loose? And what would it look like from across the street, watching them dart by the windows, sleek and black-furred and hungry, knocking over potted plants, heaps of black soil spilling from cracked terracotta as they lunged at the throats of hedge fund managers? Perhaps in the basement mailroom, a vast set of show-bright light bulbs, the kind that lined vanity mirrors in green rooms, walls lined with them to light the dark, to make the viewer squint. There would be a level replicating the experience of a migraine, floating lights, a slight hint of green on the walls, a bare floor scattered with dust and grit, and an enormous rusted pipe slowly rotating through one side of the space, slowly expanding and contracting, creaking as it went. There would be a floor dedicated to office supply hazards, stacks of papers, slippery linoleum, piles of glinting thumbtacks, errant staple guns shooting overhead, walls lined with rusting paper cutters, their blades yawning open, apt to crash down any minute in a pile of corroded metal promising tetanus. Was this all derivative? Well then, it shall be derivative. One floor would be frozen. She'd set the thermostat impossibly low and spray the place with liquid nitrogen, icicles forming in ceiling grates. Was it the rings of hell she was constructing? Should there be a man in that ring, eternally munching on his colleague's brain? Oh man, if any of you have ever had an office job, I think you're right there with that. The hot floor would contain vats of steaming black coffee, a bitter stink of burnt grounds and toner fumes. Wallpapering this floor would be documents from tobacco companies, dizzying red text printed on pink paper. Perhaps here we'd have moaning figures, neckties draped over their shoulders, parched mouths panting at the vats of coffee, unable to drink. Bright white walls and bright white floors would comprise the penultimate level. Feathers, glitter, and marshmallow fluff would drip down the walls with, why not, projections of hardcore pornography. Or the porn could be projected onto piles of white feathers scattered on the ground with a looping soundtrack of smacks and squishies. On the rooftop, the crown jewel, an enormous diamond-encrusted Buddha, his belly cut open so you could enter it. Warm and red inside, a mix of ruby rhinestones and twinkling LEDs and square pockets of deep red liquid. The greatest surprise being the portal inside of the belly swallowing you up, never to return. Kitty has many other great art plans in this novel, so you buy it and you can read them. There are many differences between Anca's book and mine, but in general, one of the concerns or ideas we both like to explore is how do we write about art without writing criticism or art history or analysis or something like that. So I'm going to actually read some bits from a different project that I've been working on. I've been working on essays, personal essays surrounding the work of choreographer Merce Cunningham. And so I'm going to read a few brief parts of one. If you don't know Cunningham, he's one of the most important choreographers, modern dance choreographers of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. So I'm going to read parts of an essay called I'm Not Writing About Summer Space, which is one of his most iconic and well-known dances. Someone mentioned summer space, and that's when I remembered summer space, and remembered that despite spending 2019, the centennial of his birth, writing about Merce Cunningham and his dances, I hadn't planned to write about summer space. That blast of turning movement both into and out of space, specks of color, light saturation, turns, sunlight through leaves, turns, decentered, mutable tempos, turning. By blast, I mean expansion. I mean opening out. I mean constant motion, then stillness just for a second before turning to motion again, as a plant waits to grow or as the flash of lightning hangs in the air. I mean this moment, just this. Enter upstage right, running. 1. The blast, not a violence, but an unbolting of vision into this one passage of time. I love summer space, but I wasn't writing about it until, of course, I was. I hadn't felt the urge to write about the environment of summer space, not about Morton Feldman's Ixion, that gentle score, its repeated high register notes spare like the loveliest little birds, like bubbles rising to the surface of a pond, except for the moment when there is a muffled effect in the bass register like distant thunder, or like daisies blooming in a field, or like dust motes in the sunlight, a glimmering and humming electronic climate, not about running. The lighting, very bright and simple, which shifts imperceptibly and appears to breathe between warm and white. Not really a flickering, though some have seen that, as if light is filtering through leaves. Warm here, referring not to the temperature or emotional state or interpersonal relations, but to the warm colors of the light spectrum. It is hard to ignore those connotations, however, just as it is hard to ignore the connotations of summer. Nor had I felt the urge to write about the polka dots and splatters of Robert Rauschenberg's pointillist backdrop. All those neon colors, not pastels after all, although at times they come across as pastels. Why would that be? Still sunny, but not like a tea party, more like a bacchanalia, and even that isn't what Rauschenberg was going for. The 58 drop cloth looked like a jungle, he said, not like a candy store. Not about the unitard costumes also dotted and splattered, so that dancers at rest are camouflaged like insects or animals whose protective coloring conceals them in their environment. When Cunningham asked Rauschenberg to make the decor, he said, "One thing I can tell you about this dance is it has no center." Not about summer space. I'm afraid it's too beautiful, too easy to love. And I'm going to read a part from the middle. Imagine New York City in summer, mid-20th century. You went to the movies for air conditioning, found the stink of garbage on every corner, the smell of pee in every subway station. Still true, though. Even these days, parents who can afford it put their little ones on buses early every morning to day camp on Long Island. Others uncap fire hydrants to fight the heat. I'm thinking about this, how hard it was to keep making art in that city when no one cared about the art you were making. How difficult. Cunningham once had $30 to procure costumes for 11 dancers and ended up buying them at Filene's basement. In the 1940s, Cunningham had a variety of day jobs, including translating Spanish medical articles into English, his drafts then polished by John Cage. I don't think Cunningham had barely a grasp of Spanish, and yet that's what he was doing. When he received a Guggenheim Fellowship in the 1950s and was asked what he would do with the money, he famously replied, eat. Imagine then, 6 weeks at Connecticut College in New London, where the company rehearsed summer space in an enormous, elegant parlor. Think humid grass, a heat that smelled of green, and then a salty breeze from Long Island Sound. The dancers remember chandeliers, high ceilings, a polished wooden floor, and French doors opening onto a beautiful expanse of landscape with vistas of lush and stately shade trees. And in that space was reimagined. Over the previous winter and spring, Cunningham had established 6 exit and entrance spots and the 21 possible paths between them, each with its own sequence of movements, runs, walks, skips, jumps, and a complex whirling phrase, and then used chance procedures to determine direction, speed, shape, the number of dancers who performed an action, and whether they performed together or separately. In New London, the numbers in Cunningham's charts and the stick figures in his notes rose up and danced. Space, movement, and time can't be separated in this dance, nor teased apart from the people dancing through space, creating varieties of time. When one dancer repeats a phrase, time repeats, does it? And when I must split, like the passage of birds stopping for moments on the ground and then going on, or automobiles were relentlessly throbbing along turnpikes and under and over clover leaves, movement that would be continuous and would carry the dancer into the playing space and out of it. My attention between one group of dancers and another, time fractures, the movement around and through, but not in the center of the stage, increases the swirling of space and time. And then, I think I'm going to read one more section from the middle here. Despite all the balletic leaps, turns, and arabesques, the mostly upright torso, the frequent symmetry, the near ubiquitous turnout, the sense of lightness, summer space still provides opportunities for awkwardness. A man hops across the stage, one leg extended behind him like a dragonfly's tail. But dragonflies skim and hover, and this dancer labors, not intentionally, but he's human after all, and part of being human is the effort it takes to jump like that, with one unmoving, extended leg. His arms spread to the sides like wings, but no, they can't create lift. His body bucks with effort as it heaves and lands, cleaving grace and awkwardness around the stage. Grace cleaving to awkwardness, and he seems relieved to jump with his feet together and then fold over his bent knees. 2 posts appeared in my Instagram feed on the same morning. First, Emily Garrity rehearsing a broken-winged balance for the New York City Ballet's 2019 revival of Summer Space. And then Silas Reiner performing a solo from Cunningham's Split Sides. Garrity, despite acknowledging the role's difficulty, I'm used to having to be light. My legs are constantly so sore. Every single movement is noticeable. It feels very bare. Is a still point, in perfect control, perfectly real. Reiner, dynamic, extends so far into balance that it becomes unbalanced. Not a mistake or a wobble, but gleefully off kilter. He has not just the ability to catch himself, but to throw himself, to be awkward. Perhaps awkward makes us feel awkward, but Cunningham loved to make his mind awkward, sought that moment when he didn't know what to do or how to do, and something new needed to happen. So thank you for listening to that. One more from here. It's the sort of the title story of the collection. And for me, it's because it touches on the themes of the collection, and it plays around with a specific form, which will be very clear from the title. And it has a tiny bit of fairy tale feel to it. So this is Bad Mother, a story in 5 paragraphs. Once there was a woman with 4 children, under the age of 10. 2 boys, 2 girls, 2 blonde, 2 dark, 2 boisterous, 2 subdued. When the eldest complained that she loved him the least, she said, "No, that's not true, and besides, I loved you first," which satisfied him for a while. Sometimes she could hear him not quite repeating her words, gloating to himself or to his siblings, "Mama loves me first." When her younger sister asked her which child she loved best, she said, "Don't be ridiculous, I love them all the same, just as our mother loved us the same," even though she knew that their mother had not loved them the same. On her deathbed, their mother had pulled her close, hand on her shirt front, surprisingly strong. "I always loved you best. Remember that," she whispered like a threat. On sunny days, when one child suddenly broke the family's harmony, she told herself, "I don't love one more than another, I just love them differently." But this was a lie. All of it was a lie. She did love one best. And not the baby, as you might expect, but the second eldest, a boy whose greatest pleasure, it seemed, was to slip his hand into hers, then quickly out again and leave something behind in her palm. She loved him better than all the others. She loved him better than her oldest son. Her best friend, who had only 1 child, said, "I didn't have another because I could never love anyone as much as I loved him." She, on the other hand, had had a second child specifically because she loved the first so much. She'd wanted to experience that love again, to feel it multiplied. Then, what a surprise to experience a love even wilder, fiercer, stronger, deeper. Her first child was quietly willful and brilliant and totally focused on the task at hand. Told to clean up his room, he put the toys away, but then also got out the dust rags, the vacuum, and the Windex. He excelled on tests of all sorts, both physical and academic. But his mother had to admit that while she found his persistence admirable, she found his fastidiousness trying and his need for approval exhausting. Whenever he brought home a report card, he sat on the front stoop until she returned from work and wouldn't let her go inside, despite the December snow or June heat, until she had noted every grade and every glowing comment. Neighbors remarked on how proud she must be, but privately she preferred the second child, whose grades varied, high in the subjects he loved, which changed every year, low in those he had no patience for, whose room always looked like a ransacked casino, and whose favorite phrase, gleaned from a self-help book he'd found on his aunt's bedside table, happy to read that as anything else, was, sometimes good is good enough. His memory was terrible, and his ability to reason logically was limited, but the minute he touched something, he thought of a question to ask about it. She loved the second child better than she loved her third one, too, the one she'd had in an attempt to diffuse the either-or relationship she had with the first two. For a while it worked. It helped that the third was a girl and that the woman could go out and buy new clothes for her, girl clothes, rather than relying on hand-me-downs, shallow though this might be. This baby destroyed Pink, though, and knew how to throw herself into a rage for apparently no reason at all. Once she grew teeth, she ate everything. Corn cobs as well as the kernels, chicken bones, her blanket, pages torn from books, like a beautiful goat. For she was such a beautiful child that strangers stared in the grocery store and told her to sign the baby up for a modeling contract. So beautiful that she herself couldn't stop looking at the little girl's perfect oval face, her eyes such a light blue they seemed to reflect the sky, her golden curls. The second child had golden curls too, but while the baby's were lovely ringlets, his were disorderly and knotted, frizzy on one side of his head, loosely loopy on the other, and his nose was bulbous, his lips too thin, his large ears stuck out, his neck too long, the kind of child who prompted relatives to remark that true beauty is on the inside. His mother loved his puppy ungainliness, but also hoped, for his sake, that he was merely an ugly duckling destined to grow into a swan. She loved her second child better than she loved her fourth, too. The second girl, called Baby, always the baby, who told funny knock-knock jokes and was so ticklish that she giggled even before your fingers found the sweet spot on the side of her waist, and laughed at everything, even her siblings' falls and failures. Not because she was malicious, but because she really and truly saw the humor in everything. She assumed that when they tripped, they did so just to amuse her, and that when they quarreled, it was for her amusement too, like the Punch and Judy show she had seen once on TV. The second child didn't laugh at the comics, could never remember his own punchlines, and looked blank when other people told jokes. "I don't get it," he said, until even his kind youngest sister rolled her eyes. Perhaps his seriousness will lead him to do great things, his mother thought. She planned her children 2 years apart and had imagined them as stair steps, littlest to biggest, youngest to oldest, separate but equal. She had pictured their photos marching tidily up the wall alongside the real steps in her house. In the heart, though, nothing is separate but equal. In fact, she stumbled up, stumbled down, stumbled among her children. Sometimes she wondered if her great love for her second child grew out of pity or guilt, or the fact that she most closely recognized herself in him. Of course, she hoped that his lack of ambition, timidity, and imperfect sense of humor wouldn't make it difficult for him to find his way in the world. Of course, she worried that she was treating her other children unfairly, and hoped she hid this as well as her mother had hidden her own unfair feelings. Of course, she worried that she identified with him too much. She too had been dull-witted, unattractive, and clumsy compared to her siblings. All this. But mostly she loved him because he demanded nothing. And her love grew every time his hand slipped into hers, even once he'd become a teenager. Grew from the berry he left behind, the bluebird feather, the striped pebble, the coin, the glove she'd dropped 2 blocks back, a meticulously drawn spaceship on a scrap of old envelope. These things made her long to pet him, his unruly hair, his dirty shirt, and his puzzled expression. Thank you. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Yeah.
How much you influenced by your own family coming up with this story?
There are 2 ways that my own life makes its way into my fiction. One is that there are like little snippets of factual things that actually happened, like, I don't know, my own son dressing up in a certain costume or something. And then there's the emotional truth. Right? So that even though all the events of a story might be invented, the emotional truth is something that I've experienced. And sometimes both of those occur in the same story. Yes.
How do you choose this form of expressing yourself, short fiction, over poetry or long fiction?
Okay, so I stopped writing poetry in high school when I realized that you really had to think about what a line was and like meter maybe, and I was just like, oh, this is too much. I'm not smart enough to do that. So I just sort of stopped. I stopped trying to write poems per se at that point and have really never looked back. And then what was the other poem?
Long fiction?
Okay, so I wrote a novel once, which never got published, and I reread it like 20 years later, and I could see why. So I think I'm drawn to what I think of as the miniature. So even when there's a longer piece, like both of the longer stories in this book are actually comprised of quite short sections that are cobbled together. I think my brain just doesn't work like in creating a long sweep of something. That's all I can say. It isn't that I dislike either the long fiction form or poetry. I love them both. They just don't seem to be what I do. Yeah.
What made you want to write about the choreographer, and are you enjoying writing essays?
So I started writing about Cunningham in about 2019. I was someplace with my husband John and Tanya Lockyer, who was director at the Velocity Dance Center here in town at that point, and she was planning a celebration for the centennial of Cunningham's birth. And John turned to her, thanked him forever for this, and said, "Oh, did you know that Maya took classes at Cunningham's studio when she was a teenager?" And Tanya turned to me and said, "Oh, maybe you could write some essays for part of the celebration." So I said yes, and I just started working on them, and as I did that, I realized a couple of things. One, I'd always loved Cunningham's work, but I hadn't really